Hey there, and welcome back to part 3 of our Pure Pleasure knit along. In last week's video we have together started and finished the back part of the Pure Pleasure top. We had a bit of struggle with the shoulder and the neckline, but finally we figured it out. And in today's video we will start with the front part of the Pure Pleasure top, knit all the way up and combine the two pieces together. So I would say let's jump right in and start. So we will begin today by casting on the same amount of stitches for the front as we did for the back. We will knit all the way to 19 centimeters and place a stitch marker right there. Continue knitting all the way to the shoulder and neckline. Do a very similar procedure to what we did at the back of the Pure Pleasure top. Then we will combine the back and the front at the shoulder part with a Kitchener stitch and on the sides with a Mattress Stitch. And that's already it. You will have finished your Pure Pleasure top. So to start with the front of your Pure Pleasure top, you will have to cast on the same amount of stitches that you casted on for the back. If you're not sure anymore how many stitches that were, just quickly check before you start, because it kind of has to add up at the end at the shoulder part. And we've cast on now the stitches that we need for our according size, and the next step will be to knit in Stockinette stitch all the way until you have 19 centimeters measured when the garment is hanging. So we'll meet again then. I reached now 19 centimeters of the front part of my Pure Pleasure top, and I will again put a stitch marker right here on this end of the row and on the other end of the row. This is actually where the two pieces, the front and the back, will start to be combined afterwards. Now you will just have to continue knitting until you reach the full length of the front part of your Pure Pleasure top, and we will meet again then to see how we do the neckline and how we combine the two shoulders. Welcome back to the last part of the front of the Pure Pleasure top. So we reached now the full length of the front part. Here you can see again our little mark where we will start knitting the two pieces together. And what we will need to do now is to finish the neckline in the front and the shoulders of the front. So for this you will find in your pattern how many stitches you will have to cast off for the neckline. So this really depends on the size, so please be sure to check. And then you know how many stitches you've casted on, deduct the stitches you have to cast off, and then divide this by 2. So for me this means that I'm now knitting 26 stitches, casting 30 stitches off for my neckline, and then knitting another 26 stitches. So again we're dividing the work into 2, which means we will finish the shoulders individually from each other, like on the back part. So I've knitted now the stitches for my right shoulder, and I will start casting off now for the neckline of the front part. Check relatively easy if you already cast off all the stitches you needed to, because you know you need to have the same amount of stitches on the left shoulder as you had on the right shoulder. So just go ahead and count them if you're unsure. When you're sure you cast off the right amount of stitches for the neckline, then you can continue in normal knit stitch to finish the left shoulder. Actually, I just realized, as this is the front, we're doing now the right shoulder and did the left shoulder before, but I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. When we were working on the back part of the Pure Pleasure top, after we cast off the stitches for the neckline, actually I put one shoulder on a separate string but then realized that actually you could also just knit on like this. So do it however you prefer, and I think for this time I will leave on both shoulder parts on the same string, as I have such a long wire between my needles. So we knitted now all the way on our right shoulder of the front part. We knitted now all the way here. And the next step will be to purl back, and when we start knitting back, we will cast off 3 stitches. So let's do that together. So we're simply purling back, no big deal anymore for you guys. So we are now again on the front of our front and we're again on the side of the neckline. So the next step will be to cast the first 3 stitches off and then continue knitting and purl back. So again, I'm knitting now the rest of the stitches, purling back, and we meet again when we're right here. So we're again at the neck of the front of the Pure Pleasure top, and the next step is to cast off another 2 stitches off the neckline. So we will do that, then knit the rest of the stitches, purl back, and meet again right here. And again we are back at our neckline, and we will do the last of the 3 cast off that we need to do here. And the last cast off is actually only 1 stitch. Then again we will knit back and purl back. Okay, so we've cast off 3 more times after casting off the middle stitches for our neckline, and that means that the next step will be to finish the shoulders in the same way as we did for the back part. So if you remember, we casted off we were supposed to cast off from the outside to the inside so that we get this kind of slant. And then I decided after casting off that I actually don't want to do it that way, but that I want to combine the back and the front with a Kitchener stitch. And therefore also now I'm gonna do the same thing. I'm gonna knit the stitches that I have to stitch, and then I will put the last stitches on a separate thread with a needle and keep them safe there. Then I will purl back and put those stitches also on a separate threaded needle. So for this I'm doing the same game again as I did with the back part. I just take my needle, a little separate thread that I have, and I just carefully put the stitches on my needle. Again, if you want to proceed with the normal pattern or with the suggestions in the pattern to cast them off, just do so. I think most important is that you go along with the same technique that you chose to do also in the back part, because otherwise of course you cannot really combine the 2 pieces. If you in the front decide to not cast off and in the back you do, that will look a bit funny. So again, I'm purling back and put also those stitches on a separate thread. So my right shoulder of the front is now finished. I have this little stairway here again that I also have in the back, so everything should work out. Oh, I have the same amount of stitches in the front and in the back, so everything should work out when I want to sew them together later on. But before we do that, we will finish of course the left side. If you remember, the last row that we knitted was on the right side of the garment in this direction, and we started casting off for the neckline. This means the next row, very important, will be a purl row before we will continue knitting in stockinette stitch on the right side and cast off the first 3 stitches here, or not the first but the last 3 stitches right here. When you purl back, you just have to knit all the way to your neckline, but don't forget to cast off the last 3 stitches before your neckline starts. So again, we have this somehow a bit stupid situation here with the many threads that we will have to sew in, but so far I didn't come up with a better solution. So I will cut off this thread and pull it through. Now I will purl back, knit back, cast off 2 stitches, purl back, knit back, cast off 1 stitch, and we are just left with the shoulder part of the pattern. So we have here our mess from the neckline, which we'll have to sew in nicely, that it looks nice and even. And we are on the left shoulder of our front of the Pure Pleasure top. So what we have to do now is to put the first stitches that you would need to cast off if you want to cast off, or if you want to make the Kitchener stick, you need to put them on a separate string. Knit the remaining stitches, purl back, and put also these stitches on a separate string. So I have now on all my shoulder parts, front and back, I have my stitches on separate threads. And the next step will be to knit the front and the back together in Kitchener stitch. But actually, before I'm doing that, I really want to get rid of this mess that I created here. And I'm gonna sew the ends in so that I have a bit clearer view of what I'm doing. I've just put the 2 pieces that I have now, the front and the back, with the wrong side on top of each other, so that outside I have the right side. Here also the right side. You can see that I have, of course, the stitches still on the strings, like we left them on both sides. And what I need to do now is to transfer them back to knitting needles to finish the shoulder part with the Kitchener stitch, or grafting stitch it's also called. So for this I just take again my circular knitting needle and start putting the stitches back on. And then of course you also have to put the stitches in the front also on the needle, even though they were on 2 separate strings. So you need to also put the stitches from the other string on the same needle. So you want to have all the stitches from one side, so this is the back side, on the same needle. And when you've done that, you can pull out your strings. The other string also, that's it. So just do the same thing for the other needle and the front of the top. So for the Kitchener or grafting stitch, as it's also called, it's really important that you have the same amount of stitches on both needles, and that you have the stitches on needles in the first place, and that you will that you have the tips of the 2 needles facing in the same way, in case you're using a circular needle like I do. If you use double pointed needles, then of course it doesn't really make a difference. Anyway, so what we will do now is we will kind of sew together the stitches in a way that it will look like we just created another knit stitch, so another V. And the combination of the 2 parts will be almost invisible. That's the really cool thing about the stitch, and it's actually not that hard to make. So what you need, of course, to do this stitch is some more yarn. So the rule of thumb is to take 3 times as much yarn as the length of the garment you want to sew together. But as we have quite thick needles and quite thick yarn, it's suggested to take 4 times as much, just to be on the sure side. So that's what we're gonna do. I will put my tapestry needle in like this. And I'm starting by entering the first stitch on my front needle from inside out. So I'm entering the stitch like this and coming out in the front. And I'm carefully pulling the yarn through until we have this 4 times the length of the piece of garment that we want to knit together. That's right here for me. So like this. Then the next step will be to enter the first stitch on the needle in the back, also from the back to the front. So we will do a similar movement like this. and just pull the yarn through. So what we've done now is we created the first combination of the 2 stitches, just so that you can see. What's a bit, really a bit tricky about not only this stitch, but actually about the yarn that we're using, is that you will not be able to see really well what I'm doing. I hope you can follow me here anyway, and I'm just gonna try to explain to you a bit better with words what I'm actually doing. So the next steps of this stitch is actually the same over and over. So what we will have to do is we enter the first stitch where we already pulled through our yarn once from inside out, from the front like this, and we exit the second stitch also from the front to the back like this, and just pull the yarn through. Be careful to create here, when you create the stitch, about the same tension as you had while knitting, so that it's really invisible what we're doing here. I forgot to say, so this stitch, the first stitch, you can now slip off. For the stitches on the back needle, you will enter the stitch also from the front to the back like this one, but then you have to be careful because you want the new stitch, you want to kind of hook it up from the back to the front like this. And then you can also lift it off. Okay, so what we will do now is we will repeat those steps over and over. So this is the stitch where we already pulled through 1 yarn. So you can actually simply take this off the needle, put through your sewing needle, and hook up the second stitch, but leave that one still on. And then for the back you can also slip off the stitch where we already put through 1 piece of yarn like this, and you can hook up this new stitch like this. Like this. Until you've reached the last stitches on your needles. So what you need to do to finish this combination of the front and the back is to enter the last stitch on your front needle, like in the same procedure as you did now. And you're just continuing with the last stitches as if nothing would have happened. So also here you're going through, and the wrong way through this one. And that's it. Now you just have to sew it in. So you can see that we've created an almost invisible combination of the front and the back. Didn't turn out 100% perfect, I have to say, but I think it also has to do with the type of yarn that we're using. But for sure it's better than if we would have just cast off the normal way and then knitted them together, because then we would have created this kind of bulge, and I really didn't want that. So actually I'm not too unhappy with the result that we created here. Next step would just be to sew in the ends. So now that we've sewed together the shoulder parts, we need to sew together the front and the back below the arm. For this we had to add some stitch markers at a certain height at the front and the back part. But what I have to say, what was a bit strange when I was reading the pattern, actually the stitch markers were never ever mentioned again. And I found this a bit irritating because the only comments they make about sewing the pieces together under the arm is to check the sketch on the next page. And on the next page, even though there was a sketch, I didn't find any stitch markers on the sketch, and I actually had to think a while until I figured out what they want to say with the sketch. So I think at the end I figured it out, and I think what they want to say is that from the stitch marker down, so here's the end of my garment, and that's the back side, by the way, the longer side. From the stitch marker down 12 centimeters, you will sew together the front and the back so that it would look like this. So what we will do now is we will measure 12 centimeters from the stitch marker, and then we'll count the rows that we have for those 12 centimeters and also count the rows on the other side and place 2 more stitch markers just to be sure that we sew them together with the right distance. So I'm now simply counting how many rows that is, because this fabric is so stretchy and so puffy that I don't think that the 12 centimeters we would measure here would actually end up exactly being the same amount of rows. So we're counting them quickly. Okay, so we're gonna put another stitch marker at 19 rows starting from here. The part that we will sew together now with the mattress stitch. And what we will do, so there are different kinds of mattress stitches. We will use the half stitch mattress stitch, I think it's called. Let me check it. Yeah, I don't know if it's actually called half a mattress stitch, but it's a mattress stitch on stockinette, and we will only use half of our V to combine them to each other. Also, you will start knitting from the lower stitch markers that we just entered together. For this, just take a piece of yarn again. And what we will have to do is to first start pulling the threads in. So to pull the thread in, what you want to do is you enter from the back to the front, and you enter the stitch right here, like actually where you have your stitch marker. Just pull the thread carefully through until you have just a little tail that you will need to sew in the end. Like this. Then you will enter the stitch on the other side, so on the front of our garment, the same way, also from the back to the front. Like this. So already at least we have a little combination of our two pieces generated here. Okay, so again, this stitch is not that easy to see on this kind of garment that we created here because the wool is just so, I mean, there's really a reason why this yarn is called Liberty, right? So we've entered now our yarn on the right side, went over to the left side to make this first bridge here, but now we need to secure this a bit. So what we will do is we will go again into the same stitch on the right side from the back to the front again, like this. Okay, so now we have created a really neat combination of the two garments. So also the next steps that we will do will be the same ones over and over. Every time we take up stitches from one side, we want to take two little bars that of course with this yarn you can see now. Nevertheless, you can feel them. Okay, so you can feel that's one bar and that's the second bar. And you pull the needle through. And now we're doing the same thing on the other side. So we already entered this stitch where we have the stitch marker, right? So we need to enter the next one. We have one bar, two bars, and we come out here. and this way we create a kind of zigzag that we can pull tighter, and we'll create, I have to take the stitch marker out, sorry. And we will create this kind of zigzag that you can see here. And by pulling this tight, it will create a really neat combination of the two pieces. So let's just continue. We're going in the stitch. We have 1 bar, 2 bars. The other side again, take 1 bar, 2 bars. Okay. And you're doing that simply until you've reached the 2 other stitch markers. After that, what you can do is you can enter the last stitch from the back to the front. Here again, from the back to the front, and just sew in your ends. Okay, that was it. So you can see that actually we created quite a neat combination of the back and the front. It's almost not visible, and just sew in your ends, and you actually finished your Pure Pleasure top. Ta-da! So there it is, you have finished your Pure Pleasure top by Wooladdicts. And I'm so happy that you knitted alongside me here with these videos, and of course I hope they were valuable to you. Why don't you let me know in the comment section below. And be sure to subscribe to my channel and hit the notification button to know instantly when a new video is online. I'm looking forward to welcome you back on my channel, and until then, I hope you stay healthy and safe. Take care, bye.